Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to all of our viewers at home watching on the live stream of this event. I am George Benitez, the Director of NATO Source and a Senior Fellow here at the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council. It is my pleasure to kick off today's event, Poised to Defend, Rebalancing U.S. Force Posture in Europe and Beyond. We are delighted to host this event in partnership with the U.S. Army War College and to host the launch of Dr. John Denny's latest study, Rotational Deployments versus Forward Stationing. How can the Army achieve assurance and deterrence efficiently and effectively? Dr. Denny, it is wonderful to have you with us today. We really look forward to hearing from you on this critical set of issues. This report could not come at a more important time. In the midst of growing uncertainty across the transatlantic community, we face some of the greatest challenges to peace and security in Europe and beyond since the end of the Cold War. A resurgent Russia continues to challenge NATO and the Euro-Atlantic community to the northeast, and instability in the Korean Peninsula poses grave concerns to regional and international security. We also have new political uncertainty across Washington and Europe, and about the future of U.S. leadership, we also have questions about the future of U.S. leadership across the world more broadly. U.S. force posture in recent years has seen a pivot to Asia, as well as important decisions made by the U.S. and its allies to place rotational multinational forces in Europe's northeast. This report makes an important contribution to the debate surrounding rotational deployments versus forward stationing. Today's conversation with Dr. Denny will expand on these important themes and will explore how we can best achieve deterrence and assurance through U.S. global force structure. Please participate in today's conversation on Twitter by following at AC Scowcroft and using the hashtag US Force Structure. To kick us off, I wanted to introduce Dr. John Denny. Dr. Denny is a research professor of security studies at the U.S. Army War College. He is also an adjunct lecturer at the American University School of International Service. Throughout his career, Dr. Denny has worked as political advisor for senior U.S. military commanders in Europe and is a strategic planner specializing in U.S. security cooperation and mil-mil relations. Instead of a traditional speech, our program will begin with a conversation with Dr. Denny about his report. I'll start us off with a series of questions and then open the floor for you to participate. We are delighted to have you with us, John. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Denny on stage. John, this is a very timely study with all the changes that have happened in European security and the frequent provocations that have been taking place in the Korean Peninsula. What prompted you to do this study in the first place?
Well, George, thank you. Let me first begin by saying thank you to you as well as to the Atlantic Council and the Scowcroft Center for hosting me today to talk about this important subject. As George mentioned, I'm a research professor at the Army War College, specifically the research arm of the War College, the SSI, or the Strategic Studies Institute. As such, I'm an officially government employee, and so I must say that the views expressed here, as well as in the study, are mine and mine alone and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. government, DoD, or the Department of the Army. So with that disclaimer out of the way, as many of you probably know, the Army specifically has, over the last 20 to 25 years, and intensifying over the last 15, gradually undergone a transition from being a force that was stationed both in the United States and overseas to one that is now mostly, nearly entirely based in the United States. So today, for example, about 91% of the U.S. Army is stationed here in the 50 states. And that's dramatically different than just a few years ago. As recently as 2004, that figure was around 78, 77%. And so this has some significant implications for how the U.S. assures and deters, as well as conducts a number of other important missions and objectives, or achieve those objectives overseas. And so this study was born of my interest in examining that, as well as the interest of the Army in trying to get some more information, better analysis, perhaps more in-depth analysis of what those implications are. And so the study attempts to look at the costs and benefits, very broadly speaking, of that shift from being kind of balanced, you might say, between the U.S. and overseas to now being mostly forward stationed.
It's interesting. It almost seems like the U.S. has shifted after the end of the Cold War into a peacetime stationing on just in CONUS on the continental United States. Why do you think the United States, in light of the new security changes that have happened in Asia and in Europe, why is the United States relying more on rotational forces as its response to this?
Well, this shift really did begin at the end of the Cold War. As many of you will know, really as the Soviet Union was falling apart, the U.S. had already begun to downsize its presence specifically in Europe. Now, there were some residual threats that throughout the 90s, and new threats for that matter, speaking specifically of concerns about the trajectory of Russia, some concerns over what might take place with a recently reunited Germany, as well as the development of new threats and security issues like ethno-religious conflict and so forth that limited the scope and pace of drawdowns that took place in the 1990s. Now, that scope and pace picked up significantly, though, in the early 2000s, and it was really the Defense Department of Donald Rumsfeld that initiated a dramatic quickening of that drawdown through a study known as the IGPBS, a rather awkward acronym, doesn't really trip off the tongue too easily. That was the Integrated Global Posture and Basing Study. And that study came out publicly in around 2003 timeframe. There was a classified annex, but the unclassified portion of it laid out the broad brushstrokes of a downsizing of our forward stationing in both Europe and Korea that would then play out really over the next dozen years or so. And when the Obama administration came into office, it put much of that on pause in the 2009-10 timeframe, largely through the 2010 QDR. But with sequestration on the horizon, the administration decided it would indeed continue with the drawdowns that were outlined in that plan of the 2003 timeframe or so. And so what we have today is really the result of a plan that was largely, with some modification, but largely put into motion about 15 years ago. And the arguments that were used by both the Bush administration and the Obama administration were really very similar, as well as by congressional advocates of restationing. And they centered on a couple of key issues. First and foremost was fiscal cost, right? It was generally assumed that it would be simply cheaper to base forces here in the States versus having them overseas. The second major argument was the change in the security environment. It was argued in the early 2000s that we simply didn't need to have armor overseas in Europe. Some argued that great powers were no longer interested in territorial conquest. So we didn't need to be as concerned about that in both Northeast Asia as well as Europe. Some of the arguments focused on usability, right? You think about the kinds of wars that we fought in the 90s and since then, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, of course, Libya. Those weren't wars that were fought where we thought we'd be fighting in the Cold War. So U.S. forces abroad weren't fighting in place. They were being sent from Germany, some cases from the Korean Peninsula, to go to Afghanistan or Iraq, etc. And the argument was, well, hey, we can do that much more easily, deploy them much more easily to operations and combat from the States than we can from these forward locations. There were also host nation politics arguments. So it was viewed that host nations were chafing under the presence of American forces abroad. The best example of that, of course, is the relationship between Okinawans and the U.S. Marine Corps. But the Army experienced this sort of challenge also, specifically in the context of its combat aviation brigade based in Bavaria, and noise violations or noise issues that the locals were dissatisfied with. There were also family readiness issues that were cited, family morale issues. So if you're a family based in Germany, stationed in Germany, and your soldier was deployed to Afghanistan, you might endure what some refer to as a double separation, right? Your soldier's off for 9 months in combat, and your extended family is back in the States somewhere. And it was argued that that was just not good for families. And if we based them all in the States, they wouldn't have to go through those double separations. There were also some institutional arguments. These are rather esoteric, but they focus on the ability and ease with which the Army can generate forces to go into combat. They also focused on issues of the BRAC, the base realignment and closure process. It was thought that we could not get away with, DOD couldn't convince Congress to initiate another round of base realignments in the states unless we had cut as deeply as possible overseas force structure and forces. There was also a training readiness argument, believe it or not. Training readiness was thought that, if we base forces in the states and then we rotate them overseas, they go through the process of shipping their equipment and personnel from fort to port, and then across the ocean. Then they go through what we call the RSO&I, that's reception, staging, onward movement and integration, that is getting to their operational base in Europe or Korea. That's really important training, right? And that's the kind of training they would do during a crisis. We want soldiers to have that. So let's put them back in the states where they can do that. And then there were other nebulous arguments, you might say, political arguments to some degree. And again, many of these are tied to the sequestration that we saw unfold over the last 6 years. The Army, as we all know, went through a significant end strength cut as a result of sequestration and the end of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the Army did cut force structure in the states, went from 45 brigade combat teams, or BCTs, down to eventually 32. 10 of those 13 cut came from within the U.S., but 3 of them came from overseas. And the Army believed it needed to cut those overseas, those units overseas, instead of trying to take them from other places in the states.
I think it's very important for us to have a clear understanding of what was the rationale for the decision to start using rotational forces more often. So thank you for explaining that. But now it's 2017, and there have been several changes to the security environment in Europe and in Asia. So how have these expectations and assumptions held up?
I try to, in the study, look at 4 different areas. And I should note that the reason why we're now back to rotational, we've relied upon rotational presence increasingly over the last couple of years, really since 2014, 2015, is that both the U.S. and its allies and partners don't assess our forward station presence as sufficient for deterrence and assurance. So we're now rotating forces over to both Korea as well as to Europe. We've been doing that in Korea since about 2015, exactly 2 years now, an Armored Brigade Combat Team, an ABCT, you'll hear me use that acronym a lot, has been rotating from the States over to Korea. We've been doing it off and on in Europe since September 2014 up until January of this year. And January of this year, we started now heel to toe, that is continuous ABCT rotations to augment what we already have in theater. In my view, in the study, I try to...
Could you explain a little bit about heel to toe?
Yes, of
because
course.
It's a ABCT always in Europe, but it's not the same ABCT.
Exactly. Heel to toe means essentially that there's a continuous presence. As soon as one leaves, another's on site. In fact, there's overlap of typically about 2 weeks, where the incoming ABCT arrives. They do what the military call a right seat, left seat ride, right? Where they conduct the same mission, whether it's exercises or patrolling or what have you, side by side for 2 weeks, ideally. And then the unit that's been there for 9 months, they go home. And the unit that's just arrived, they're now in theater for 9 months. So we've been doing that in Korea since summer of 2015. We just started it in January 2017, heel to toe, continuous rotations of these ABCTs. So in the study, I try to group these various arguments that I've outlined earlier into 4 big baskets. And the first of those is really in terms of fiscal cost, and try to assess whether or not the fiscal arguments have really held up. And the benefit I have over some of the studies that have looked at this over the past decade or so, this issue of rotational versus forward presence, is that we've got some actual data now, right? We've got hard data that I was able to obtain from both 8th Army in Korea, as well as U.S. Army Europe and EUCOM over in the European theater, about what it's cost us to do these kinds of things we've been engaged in. And there seems to be universal agreement that, in fact, the rotational model has cost us more than it would have to forward station an ABCT. And what I've done in the study is I use the data that's available currently to try to compare an ABCT rotationally deployed from Fort Hood, Texas, with an ABCT rotationally deployed to, I should say, forward stationed in Europe, specifically in Germany. And the recurring costs, I'll talk about fixed costs in a minute, one-time cost, but the recurring costs shows a difference of about $135 million on average per year, higher cost for rotational deployments. Now, there are a couple of big reasons for that. The two most important ones are, first and foremost, transportation. Because for every ABCT we send, we're sending equipment with it. It is extraordinarily expensive. The Army estimates today it's $38 million per rotation to send an ABCT's worth of tanks and all their equipment one way across the ocean. So that's very expensive and accounts for a big part of the cost difference. The other element that's pretty important in the cost differential is the fact that those rotationally deployed units have a higher operations tempo, or what we call op tempo. What I mean by that is when they're on rotation in Poland and spread out across the other 6 countries of Eastern Europe, which is what we're doing now. They're not in one country, they're spread across 7 countries. They are constantly active, constantly exercising. They don't get weekends off. They're doing something all the time, right? And you can't keep up that pace with a forward stationed unit. We would send them home on weekends. They wouldn't be in Poland for 9 months at a time. They might only be there for a month at a time. So they maintain these rotational units to maintain a very high op tempo, and that results in some higher costs. So with the recurring cost clear, if you look at the one-time costs, obviously for forward station forces, you've got to build infrastructure, right? You've got to do that for these rotational deployments too, but those are operating sites that those soldiers are only going to use temporarily. We don't need, for example, chapels and schools and family housing and commissaries and all the things that you would build if you were forward stationing. So what I've done in the study is to outline 5 different options, 4 of them in Germany, 1 in Poland, and to estimate what the cost would be, the one-time cost of each of those options, and then apply the $135 million in savings generated by forward stationing and see what the payoff period is. How long does it take us to break even? And depending upon the option chosen, it could take anywhere from as little as 1.5 years to as many as 12 to 13 years to hit the break-even point, given these infrastructure or one-time costs. So again, we have to ask ourselves, how long do we think we'll be keeping up this pace in places like Europe and the Korean Peninsula of rotating, right? Because at some point, it really will outweigh the costs of investing in the infrastructure. The second area I look at is unit training readiness in terms of assessing the validity of these arguments that were used. And here the data really is, or the evidence really is mixed, right? These units that are rotationally deployed, they go over to Germany or Eastern Europe or Korea with a 30-day intense National Training Center or NTC rotation immediately before they deploy, okay? So they're at the height of readiness. They then go overseas for their rotation for 9 months, and as I mentioned, they maintain this really high op tempo. So they're maintaining, even perhaps building readiness while they are on deployment. Now that increased unit readiness for these rotational units is somewhat offset though, because on the other hand, these rotationally deployed units don't deploy all of their manpower. So they maintain a pretty significant amount of manpower back at home station, back at Fort Hood, for example. So on average, only about 70% of the unit rotates. It's only about 70% of the manpower of that unit is rotated overseas for that deployment. Okay, sometimes that's as low as 67% or so. In contrast, forward station units, they've got to maintain an Army standard of 95% manning. Okay, so you've got a much higher manning rate for the forward station units. Also, at least with regard to Europe, where we have a 3-year tour overseas, those units, they develop a much higher level of interoperability. They know their counterpart units better. They know the mayors and the governors better. They know the roads better, right? They know all of what's going on in their theater better than that rotationally deployed unit. Now, that rotationally deployed unit can get up to speed pretty quickly, in 9 months perhaps, but then after 9 months, they're done and gone, and they leave.
Clean slate again.
A clean slate again, and we start over with a new unit, okay? The third area I look at is in terms of Paul Mill implications. And here it's pretty clear our allies, while they like rotational presence, they'll take it if that's all that's offered, they prefer the permanence and the sign of commitment evidenced by forward stationing. Okay? In fact, there's evidence to indicate that forward stationing and the material benefits, that is the families spending money on the local economy, that can sometimes overcome or outweigh these negative repercussions of U.S. units being abroad, like the noise issues I mentioned earlier. And finally, I look at soldier and family well-being and morale. And here, although some would argue within the Army that, hey, soldiers they prefer not to be in their barracks all the time. They want to get out and rotate and overseas and go exercise and do things that soldiers signed up to do. And that is certainly true. But there's a much stronger body of evidence, anecdotal evidence, emerging that indicates that soldiers are dissatisfied with these recurring 9-month, 10 months if you add the train up, rotations overseas and away from family, right? Because they're being asked to do the exact same thing, almost, not quite as dangerous, obviously, but in terms of time away from family, as a combat rotation to Afghanistan or elsewhere. And yet they're not getting the same kind of moral or material, that is pay, benefits that you would get if you were deployed to a combat operation. What's most interesting is that there appears to be some evidence that this is backed up by reenlistment data. And here specifically in the study, I compared reenlistment data of units that have rotated with all other Army BCTs, Brigade Combat Teams, over the same period of time. And I looked at 12 months after those units came back from their rotations. And there are only 4 units available that have a 12-month period of data available. But I can tell you that 3 of those 4 units have a lower than other Army BCT and reenlistment rates for first-term reenlistments. And it varies from between 3 and 12% lower than all other Army BCTs. When compared to an overseas unit, like the 2nd Stryker Cavalry Regiment, this is a Stryker brigade based in Germany, the reenlistment rates are much lower, ranging from 12 to 35% lower. And so I can't yet say that's causal. I can't say that the evidence isn't there yet to say, oh, well, this unit has lower reenlistment because we're rotating them. That's not the case yet. I wouldn't make that argument. But there clearly seems to be an emerging correlation between these two things, that is, rotations and lower first-term reenlistments.
I think this is one of the strengths of this report, that it really, for the first time, shows that a lot of the assumptions we had when the decisions were made to choose rotational forces, now we have a lot more data about what are the actual costs. And in addition to the ones that you've mentioned, I'm also struck by the political data that we have. So there were a lot of assumptions that, when the U.S. bases in Europe and in Korea, there are a lot of media stories about, the noise pollution and friction with the local communities. But I've seen, once these forces were withdrawn, once we withdrew 4 brigades from Europe, once we consolidated our bases in Europe, overwhelmingly, I saw that the host communities were sorry to see the U.S. presence withdrawn and would much have preferred that the units had stayed there in their own communities. But now that, in addition to these economic costs, how do you think the U.S. force structure should evolve in Europe and in Korea?
I think, first of all, with regard to the host nation aspect, I think you're exactly right. I had the opportunity as part of the study to interview host nation relation officials over with U.S. Army Europe, as well as with EUCOM, and also to talk to European officials, specifically the Polish Ministry of Defense. And I heard many of the same things that you just mentioned, that at the local level, the regional level, and in the central government level, our partner nations, our allies, are in fact eager for more of this forward station presence, both for strengthening deterrence and assurance, but also, of course, for some of the material benefits that comes with that, to mitigate some of these downsides, as I mentioned. The study tries to look forward and tries to recommend sort of a 5 to 10 year approach, because we have to remember that the presence we have today in Europe and Korea is not the result of a decision made last year or 2 years ago or even 5 years ago. It's really the result of a process that began unfolding 15 years ago. And so if we want to affect what posture looks like 10 years from now, we have to give a lot more thought to the analysis now and thinking about where we ought to be. And so I've got a series of about 9 different recommendations. Some are tied pretty close to each other. But the first of those in the study is to end these back-to-back continuous 9-month rotations, to Europe and Korea at least. It seems as if, as I mentioned, that this is not a positive thing for morale, and that the Army should get away from that and resort instead to shorter-term, non-continuous, that is non-heel-to-toe rotational deployments to augment more forward stationing. The second recommendation is to forward station heavy units and equipment-intensive units, right? This gets at some of the cost issues I mentioned earlier. If it's really expensive for us to rotate an armored brigade combat team, Also perhaps combat aviation, helicopter units, rotary wing units. The same also probably applies to air defense artillery units. Those are the kinds of units that you probably want forward stationed, right? To minimize those recurring fiscal costs every time. Third, you also want to forward station those units, though, that really need to have local knowledge. Okay, so for example, it's important for an infantry brigade combat team to know how NATO works and how to speak NATO, for example, know what the local rules of the road are in places like Poland and Hungary and the Baltic states. But it's really important for a combat aviation brigade to know the local airspace rules and regulations, right? The particularities of operating in a theater like the Korean Peninsula. That sort of knowledge is very difficult to develop in a 2-week right seat ride, and you'd want those kinds of units forward-based, okay? Fourth, specifically with regard to Europe, I recommend in the study, we ought to forward station an Armored Brigade combat team, a combat aviation brigade, air defense artillery, fires unit, that is artillery and rockets, command and control, division or corps level headquarters, we don't have that now in theater, and all the enablers that are necessary to make all those units be able to do what they have to do in theater. Fifth, if we're going to do this in Europe, we ought to aim to do so in Poland. Forward stationing in Poland, at least with regard to the ABCT, would have, and perhaps in part or in whole, that is, as many of you may know, we've got a brigade based in Italy, but we split base it. It's actually mostly in Italy. Part of it is in Germany. We may consider split basing in ABCT, some of it in Poland, some in Germany. But basing at least some of this in Poland would have a stronger impact on deterrence and assurance. Sixth, if we can't forward station in Poland, Germany is a great alternative because it would allow us to get armor and some of these other critical capabilities back into Europe. 14 years ago, the congressionally mandated Overseas Basing Commission found in looking at the IGPBS that the big problem, one of the big problems, in addition to strategic lift, was that we were taking all the armor out of Europe, removing really important capability that we needed to have at least some of in Europe. And by putting an ABCT back in Germany, we at least are able to satisfy that requirement, and we can use that unit then to occasionally deploy that armor over to Poland and other countries in Eastern Europe, augmenting the enhanced forward presence battalion we're going to maintain in any case in Poland now. Seventh, in the case of Korea, I argue we'd return a forward station ABCT to the peninsula and maintain the combat aviation, air defense, all the enablers, and the command and control. And if possible, we ought to try to normalize as many of those billets, many of those positions as possible. And what I mean by that is make those rotations, or I should say those appointments to Korea, a normal 3-year tour. Right now, as many of you may know, a normal tour in Korea for most soldiers and families, or for soldiers really, often leave their families behind, is a 1-year tour. If we normalize those tours to 3 years, we'll do away with a lot of this personnel churn that has plagued our deployment, our stationing in Korea. Eighth, if we're going to forward station some of the heavier units, as well as those that really need to have an intense knowledge of the local operating environment, we ought to rely, where necessary, on lighter units. Infantry brigade combat team, Stryker brigade combat teams, for occasionally augmenting our forward stationing with rotational deployments. But again, short term, not continuous. And then finally, if possible, we ought to increase this forward stationing through an increase in end strength. Okay, so if we're going to increase the size of the Army, it'd be best to then take that increase in size and apply it to overseas units. That's going to be a lot more politically palatable to our Congress if we do that versus moving a unit from somewhere in the States and sending it overseas. Now that said, history shows that if the executive branch is united, that is, if there's a consensus, a strong one, among state, DOD, the NSC, and the White House, and if they're firm in their efforts, that DOD, or I should say the government, the executive branch, can often convince the Congress of the necessity of moving an extant entity or unit from the states over to Europe?
You have a lot of great ideas in your recommendations, and they're very persuasive, making very good arguments in favor of efficiency and performance. But this is Washington, with a very, shall we say, fluid political environment, and with a lot of political concerns also in Europe. So how realistic are these recommendations?
I think, frankly, I think they are. Judging from the political environment, it seems pretty clear, at least on the Hill, specifically in the person of Senator John McCain, chairman of the SASC. He's been pretty vocal in his thoughts on the need for increased forward stationing. Just this week, across the Hill, the HASC chairman released his mark, and in that markup of the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, the HASC calls for a study of the Army's overseas presence in order to rebalance it. So I think there's a consensus on the Hill, at least, among those that are concerned with our national security posture overseas, that we've gotten out of balance, and we need to adjust that. Clearly, among our allies, as I mentioned, there's an appetite for greater American presence abroad, a more permanent American presence abroad through forward stationing. I think in terms of the foreign policy epistemic community, the folks that work at places like the Atlantic Council and elsewhere, other think tanks around town, there seems to me, to my perception at least, an emerging consensus that we do indeed need to be doing more. Within the halls of the Army, with the halls of the Pentagon right now, in fact, that's the direction we're leaning. Many of you may know the Army got an end strength increase in the 2017 NDAA, and parts of that end strength or increase are already earmarked to increase some of the enablers over in Europe. And that's, I think, a good thing. Fiscally, of course, this might be something of a challenge. With regard to Europe right now, these rotational deployments, they are funded through the Overseas Contingency Operations budget. That is, they're not part of the Army's base budget. If we forward station some of these units, that will probably have to be funded out of the base budget, and that may be difficult for the Army and DoD to swallow right now in the current fiscal environment. In terms of logistics and the nuts and bolts of where we could do this and whether we could do it overseas, the Army in Europe already has a pretty good idea of what's available within Germany, of what the costs might be in terms of infrastructure development or improvements. And thanks to our operating sites in Poland and the 6 other East European countries, we've got a good idea also of what's available in Poland. We also know that the Poles, when it comes to at least our rotational presence right now, have been willing to cost share. As long as there's some co-use allowed, they've been willing to cost share on both infrastructure development and base operations. So I think the environment is probably right. Certainly, if we see in the 2018 NDAA another increase in Army end strength, I think that the environment is perhaps even more positive.
This study has done a really good job of arguing that according to certain key metrics such as financial cost, readiness, pull mill considerations, and social family pressure, permanent stationing of U.S. forces in Europe is a better option than relying on rotational presence. But what about the metric of deterrence? Do permanent forces send a stronger message of commitment and willingness to defend than rotational forces? For example, since the U.S. has switched to rotational forces, have the Russians and North Koreans behaved less provocatively, more provocatively, or the same?
I think it's difficult for me to establish the causal relationship or to argue causality between the American shift to mostly U.S. stationing and increased saber rattling on the part of the North Koreans and Russia's activities in Georgia nearly a decade ago, and certainly in Ukraine a couple of years ago. But it seems clear to me that there's something of a correlation. It also seems clear that we and our allies and partners assess that we need to do more in response to these things, and that we need to bolster not simply assurance, which is much, you can't really measure either assurance or deterrence quantitatively, but it's easier to assess from a qualitative perspective. And here I think it seems pretty clear that there's strong evidence to indicate that both in the U.S. and among our allies, we're not doing enough, we're out of balance, and there needs to be some shift toward increased forward stationing.
The study does mention that there are some restrictions imposed by the NATO-Russia Founding Act on your recommendation of the permanent stationing of NATO forces in former Warsaw Pact countries. It is clear to me that Russia has violated this agreement, and that any responsible reading of the text of the agreement shows that it was conditional on the peaceful security environment at that time. The NATO-Russia Founding Act is not applicable to today's security environment, which is defined by Russia's military aggression. But, unfortunately, not all NATO leaders agree with us. Some allies will strongly oppose the recommendation of permanent stationing of forces as a dangerous unilateral escalation by the U.S. Could you address the negative consequences to the alliance unity that may come from implementing your recommendations, and elaborate in more detail why the benefits of permanent U.S. forces in Eastern Europe outweigh the cost of potentially increasing divisions within the alliance?
Yeah, certainly. I take this up in the study, and it really is, as you mentioned, it's probably the largest challenge or greatest hurdle in terms of forward stationing in a place like Poland. As many of you may know, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, signed 2 decades ago, essentially committed the Western allies to limiting their permanent presence in the former Warsaw Pact countries that were becoming, or that looked to become, allies in NATO. And at the time, and really since then, NATO has interpreted limiting substantial permanent presence to mean basically a brigade, okay? Actually, early on, the U.S. and the West had argued that no, that ought to be a division. The Russians argued no, a brigade, and so we sort of settled on interpreting this as a brigade. For some of our allies, especially the Germans, the NATO-Russia Founding Act is almost sacrosanct. And any attempt to forward station, even on the basis of just a brigade forward station, is going to be a very heavy lift diplomatically. But I would point out a couple of things. First, as many of you may know, the NATO-Russia Founding Act is not a treaty. It was a political agreement. It was not ratified by our government the way a treaty would be, nor by any of our NATO allies.
Like the Budapest Memorandum.
Yeah, maybe so. So this is not, to change a political agreement is, both in theory and practice, easier than changing a treaty. Political agreements are indeed subject to evolving political interpretation. And I think that therefore, the window of possibility is slightly more ajar than it would be if this were a treaty. The second thing I would mention is that the alliance has a history of changing its force posture. NATO force posture has never been static, even during the Cold War. And so, for example, I would cite the example of, when Germany joined the alliance in 1955. At that time, in the early 50s, NATO's forward line of defense was really the western, or I should say the eastern border of the Benelux, okay? But once Germany joined the alliance, and then through the 50s into the 60s, that line got pushed forward. And with it, Western U.S. force posture, force presence, until that forward defense line became the inter-German border. So we've got a history in the West of adapting our posture and our presence to changing security environment and to changing membership. And so I think, I don't want to dismiss or make light of the diplomatic lift necessary to achieve this, but it's one we have to engage in, and one that is clearly going to be long-term. We need to begin to think in those kinds of terms and try to convince the rest of our allies, especially Berlin, that what we are seeing emanate from Moscow is not merely a short-term storm, but rather a climate change in Europe, and we need to adapt accordingly.
Thank you, John. This has been an excellent and very thought-provoking conversation. I'd like to open it now for some questions from you in our audience. If you could please raise your hand, and we will bring a microphone to you. And before you ask your question, please identify yourself with your name and your affiliation. Thank you. Sir.
Yes, my name is Keith Hill. I'm with Bloomberg BNA, but I'm here as a private citizen. My question is, would you like to see your recommendations reduced to statutory language rather than having future administrations or try to implement what you've recommended?
Good question. I think that history has shown that this is the kind of thing that is our force posture is the kind of thing that we need both the executive and the legislative branch on board with, right? It's easier to achieve some of these changes and adaptations if the legislative branch is along for the ride, so to speak. And so while I think it would be very useful to have Congress express its strong support for these kinds of force posture changes that I would recommend, at the end of the day, I would be reluctant to argue that this ought to be in black and white in statute. I think that would probably tie the hands of the executive branch too greatly. Obviously, we don't want a situation, in my view at least, I don't think we want a situation in which we are dramatically changing our force posture year on year or administration on administration. We want some constancy there. And so we want to generate a consensus in our foreign policy community, both left and right. And the best way to do that, I think, is if the executive branch leads clearly, but explains to Congress very clearly what the advantages are of forward presence and does this with the Congress. But as I mentioned, if necessary, the executive branch has the ability, based upon historical example, to really be to lead on this. And if they can do that, then I think they can bring Congress along without writing some of this detail down into statute that I think would tie the executive branch too much.
We have a question here in the front row. Hans, please.
Thank you. Hans Benendijk. John, thank you for doing the study. I think it's very useful. I think the cost estimates in particular are incredibly important because this is an ongoing question, which is more efficient, rotational or forward stationing. I think your recommendation in general also is consistent with some studies that RAND has done in terms of the need for additional forward deployments of ground forces in the Baltic area, in particular in Poland. But I think you may be underestimating some of the political difficulties that we would see in trying to implement something like this. First of all, I think you have, these forces are going to be coming out of U.S. bases, and that immediately raises the question of the senators and congressmen who are affected by this, and they're going to fight it, and that's been the pattern. We have a Trump administration that is saying we're already doing too much of the burden sharing in the United States. This might well be seen as doing more rather than less. So that's a second political problem you're going to face. I'm not sure that in Germany, given the state of U.S.-German relations today, they're going to embrace something like this. Poland would, but I'm not sure about Germany. And then you have the question you raised about the Founding Act, and maybe Sandy wants to comment on this too, but it seems to me if we're going to do something like this, we're going to have to be able to interpret these forward deployments as being consistent with the Founding Act rather than abandoning the Founding Act, because I don't think politically that's not going to work in Europe. So I think we have more political difficulties than you suggested. And so therefore, I would not abandon quite as quickly as you do the notion of rotational deployments. I think they've proven to be very useful. And we might want to think alternatively about ways to reduce the cost of rotational deployments. For example, keeping the equipment in Europe and just rotating forces on existing equipment. So I think there are a lot of other options that we're going to be thinking about as well, to include improvements in naval and air deployments that could accomplish the same thing from a deterrent point of view.
Thank you, Hans. Sandy, did you have two fingers on this?
Thanks very much. Congratulations, John, on a very important study. I share Hans's concerns about the potential political obstacles both here and in Europe to moving to the permanent stationing model. The Founding Act is a very sensitive issue as well, despite what you said, George, about the Russians having violated it, which is certainly true. Allies have made a conscious decision to sort of maintain the diplomatic high ground and continue to abide by the Founding Act, hoping that someday, maybe after Putin is long gone, that Russia will come back into compliance with it. But the issue of compliance in a technical sense is actually, there's more flexibility than some people think. There was a detailed study done at NATO, and there's been some public commentaries about this. There was never any agreement inside NATO or with the Russians on what is the actual definition of substantial combat forces. The Russians tried repeatedly in Brussels and also in CFE negotiations to try to define it as a brigade per country. But even that was never accepted by NATO, nor, as I understand it, within the U.S. Defense Department, because of the understandable desire to maintain flexibility. And that is understood to this day, that the Russians may have said a brigade per country, and what we're doing so far is well below the Russians' definition. We're not constrained by the Russian definition going forward. But that all being said, it wouldn't be easy to move from 1 battalion per country to a brigade or even more. But in some ways, the substantial combat force issues is more important than the rotational versus permanent, as when it comes to the Founding Act. It's the quantitative thing that is most important. I had a question about whether you would lose some flexibility to rotate to other countries if you made the ABCT in Poland permanent, with families and all the accoutrements. So it would kind of imply that it's more of a fixed entity. Would you lose some of both the flexibility and the training value, but also the political reassurance value that comes by having this ABCT sort of touching down in Poland, but fanning out across those 7 countries in the course of its 9-month rotation?
Thank you for those important questions. John?
Yeah, thank you. Let me start by addressing some of the points that Hans mentioned. First, with regard to removing forces from U.S. bases, I totally agree, and I mentioned that in the report, that I discussed it in the report. It's more than just a mentioning, that, yeah, this is going to be painful if we're going to try to do this from the existing force structure in the States, and that's why the report argues in its recommendations that, in fact, any increase in forward stationing ought to occur upon the basis of an increase in Army end strength. So if we're going to grow the Army, grow it overseas. And that is, in fact, the way the Army's viewing this right now. As I mentioned, with this relatively small increase they were authorized for 2017, there's a big chunk of that is earmarked to be grown or developed overseas, in Europe specifically. But I agree with you. Clearly, it's an easier lift if it's done overseas instead of pulling a unit from Texas or elsewhere. Secondly, with regard to the Trump administration's willingness to put more into Europe, my research is based with extensive conversations on folks inside the Pentagon and elsewhere across the defense establishment. And my read of the mood in the Pentagon right now is that, in fact, this is, as George mentioned in his introductory remarks, there's perhaps no better time to be asking this question. And that's spot on, because this topic has come to light largely because of questions asked by the transition team and that have emerged from Secretary of Defense Mattis's re-examination, for lack of a better word, of how we're doing things within DoD. I think at least within DoD, there is, and perhaps within the NSC, judging from what I'm told by folks I've spoken with in the Pentagon, that there is a strong appetite within this administration to increase our presence. And in fact, evidenced by this 2017 end strength increase, putting more in Europe, that's the direction we're leaning. I have no doubt that that's probably not getting the press it deserves, maybe on purpose.
And the increase in the EDI also reinforces that. Good
point. Yeah, the increased funding. That's a very good point. I think there's appetite within the administration, at least parts of it, to do this. In terms of Germany embracing an increase in forward stationing, it's clear based upon my discussions with host nation officials, I should say U.S. Army Europe and EUCOM authorities who are responsible for host nation relations, that there is appetite within Germany for increased forward basing. I can tell you that one of the places that U.S. Army Europe and EUCOM were looking at if they were going to increase forward stationing in Germany would be facilities that are about to be abandoned by the UK and northern Germany. And so the local officials up there would love nothing more, both local and regional, than to have Americans take up some of those facilities. That would help the German MOD as well, who are examining what they need to do to increase their own end strength, and want to find out what the Americans and maybe even the Brits might be doing to increase forward presence in Central Europe. So I think there's a strong appetite even among the Germans for this increase. With regard to the Founding Act, yeah, I don't think we should abandon it. And in fact, in a piece tomorrow I have coming out at the Carnegie Europe website, Judy Dempsey's blog, I argue that we ought to simply ignore it. In fact, reinterpret it to the extent we can collectively, but if necessary, simply bilaterally. As many of you may know, the presence that we have today in places like Germany and Italy, those aren't NATO agreements, right? Those are bilateral agreements that we have with the Germans, with the Italians, with the Belgians, with the Dutch, to maintain American forces in their country. So it's possible we could do this bilaterally. I have no doubt that that would still probably piss off the Germans. But it's possible that this could be done in a bilateral context to reinterpret, or in my word, ignore the provisions, some of the provisions of the Founding Act, which certainly the Russians seem to have done. They haven't abandoned it or abrogated it formally. They've simply ignored it. I think we could probably get away with the same in the West. With regard to keeping the equipment overseas, the Army actually looked at that option. And the plan a couple of years ago was, in fact, to do that. And the Army was considering, how do we build up a brigade set, an armor brigade combat team set of equipment in Europe. And frankly, the challenges are greater than the Army considered initially. And so that plan is now no longer the one the Army is aiming for. And the plan for the foreseeable future, for reasons I can go into perhaps offline, is for the Army to rotate every time personnel and equipment. So that's just as it looks right now for the next couple of fiscal years. And then with regard to naval and air, here I'll fall back on my institutional affiliation. I mean, as those of you familiar with the Army War College would know, I'm going to have to argue that, in fact, naval and air could not achieve this deterrence and assurance in the same way. And I think, frankly, more objectively, there's good evidence to indicate that that's the case as far as it's viewed by our allies. Air presence, naval power are very important in deterrence and assurance. But people live on land, and the Army and the Marine Corps operate on land. And so if we're going to really deter and assure, there's got to be a strong, really it's got to be at the core, C-O-R-E, of our overseas force posture. With regard to the challenge of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, again, getting back to what I've mentioned, I don't doubt that this is a difficult challenge for us, but I think that the time has come to attempt a long-term diplomatic effort, right? The window I'm looking at is 10 years out. Where do we want to be in 10 years? Well, to achieve that, we ought to begin this process now of adapting our interpretation of what substantial means and of perhaps signaling that to the Russians as we can, but doing so in a way that allows us to reassure our allies more effectively and efficiently than we have to date. I'm not convinced, based upon the available evidence, that what we are doing now is sustainable, right? What we want to achieve is a sustainable deterrence. It's very clear that based upon fiscal costs alone, recurring fiscal costs, what we're doing is not sustainable. It may be also the case that it's not sustainable from a family morale, soldier well-being point of view either. So if we want to achieve a sustainable, efficient, and effective deterrence and assurance posture, we need to re-examine, we need to rebalance what we're doing today.
So I'm going to summarize you. To have effective and sustainable deterrence, we need NATO boots on the ground.
We do.
We have a question on this side from the second row.
Yes, thank you. Peter Michael Nielsen from the Danish Embassy. I can clearly understand both the rationale for considering permanent presence, but also agree with some of the political issues that will be around that, in particular in relation to the NATO Founding Act, which is also a concern on our side. But I would actually like to ask you, because something that I haven't heard you address, but has been underlined also as a benefit of rotational deployment, is that it provides an opportunity to train reinforcements across the Atlantic, and have you sort of weighed that cost and assessed that aspect, which is clearly an important part also after it having become very rusty, you could say, over the years where we haven't done it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. As I mentioned, my read of the available evidence, such as it is on unit training readiness, is frankly mixed. And I did weigh, because it's very important to the Army, right? To go through the motions of taking an armored unit from Texas, putting all of its stuff on rail, getting it to the port, and then shipping it on a boat over to Bremerhaven, unloading it, sending it on to operating sites. That is exactly the kind of training or kind of thing they would do, operations they would perform in the event of a real crisis. And if we had to deploy that unit over to Europe or to Korea. So there's clearly value in that. But that has to be weighed against all of the other factors that I mentioned. The excessive cost involved in that. The impact that these frequent, every 9 months, rotations have on families and soldiers. The diplomatic implications. Is it better to be forward based? Is that a stronger signal than rotationally deploy? We have to weigh all this evidence. And so in the end, I come down on the side of really a blend, a mix of forward station and rotationally deployed. As I argue in the paper, and as I mentioned here today, I think for cost reasons and for interoperability reasons, we should forward station those armored units, combat aviation, air defense units, etc., command and control as well. We should forward station that stuff. But we still ought to maintain occasional, not heel to toe, shorter term rotations from the U.S. over to Europe and South Korea. That would allow us to still maintain within our Army, within our military forces, this muscle memory of how to go from your U.S. fort to the port, etc., over across the ocean. Still enable us to do that. It would still enable us to strengthen on occasion deterrence and assurance with these occasional deployments, but it would also allow us to minimize the fiscal costs, to minimize the impact on soldiers and families, to signal a greater commitment to deterrence and specifically assurance with our allies, and to garner the benefits of interoperability gained by a 3-month tour of a forward station unit.
I think in addition to the many points we've covered so far, the Russians are giving us new reasons to consider the merits of permanent station forces rather than rotational. In the last week, the Russian Navy harassed a civilian cargo ship that was transporting military equipment and supplies for one of our exercises in Europe. So they're giving us some reason to see why it may be better to have these things already on the continent than rather than having to move them in every year. We have time for one more question from the audience. Please, Stephen, in the front row.
Stephen Blank, American Foreign Policy Council. First of all, it sounds like a great study. Second, the question I have is, you talked a lot about contingencies and stationing in Baltic states, Poland, Germany, and so on. But since the Russian buildup of ground forces is actually taking place in and around Ukraine, that's where they've created divisions and armies, what about implementing some of your recommendations in the Balkan or Black Sea area?
I was primarily focused in this study on deterrence and assurance across, especially northeastern Europe, but I did consider as well the effect that some of these things would have, some of the recommendations would have in the Balkans. It seems to me that the larger problem set, though, is across the plains of north-central Europe. And so while there could be some deterrent value, reassurance value certainly, in stationing some of these, forward stationing some of this capability in places like Romania or Bulgaria, it's there that I would look to more rotational deployments sourced from units that are based in Europe, but also perhaps sourced from units based in the U.S., but augmented as well by perhaps naval and air units, naval and air forces, I should say, that would deploy sourced from the United States. I think that the center of gravity, though, and the challenge that we face is really in the Baltic states and Poland. And so it's for that reason that the study recommends focusing any forward stationing forces largely in Poland or Germany, Central Europe.
I'd like to thank you all for a great discussion today. Also to remind you that you can watch this live on our webcast from our website. You can follow us on AC Strategy, Scowcroft, and also on our hashtag US Force Structure. And I just wanted to give John some couple of minutes in case you wanted to have any last words.
Thank you, George. Yeah, the only thing I want to mention first is a nuts and bolts issue. The cover of the study is what appears to the stage left here of George, and it is not yet available at our website. You'll see there's a QR code at the bottom. If you scan that QR code, you'll be taken to the webpage where it will be printed. Hopefully it's with the copy editors now. Hopefully it'll be up by late July, early August. For those of you watching virtually, you can go to our website. That's ssi.armywarcollege.edu to find where this report will be posted. And then final point is, again, I just want to reiterate the importance of study and analysis, right? Too often over the past 15 years when it's come to this issue, even when the IGP-ABS was first promulgated, often we had the answer of the cart ahead of the analysis of the horse. And that is problematic. So we need to give careful study to this issue now and not simply respond to political or budget-driven imperatives in order to arrive at a quick answer, what we think may be correct now. So my hope is that my study offers a first step or a step in that process. So thank you again.
Thank you, John, for collecting all this great data. Appreciate it.